Welcome to The Source, where we combine the headlines with in-depth conversations with the newsmakers themselves. Sitting in for Pinky Webb, I'm Ria Tanjuatco-Trillo. Today on the program, President Bongbong Marcos signs into law the SIM Registration Act. Some lawmakers are questioning the confidential and intelligence funds in the proposed 2023 budget. And what can the government do as the peso continues to weaken against the dollar? Marikina Representative Stella Quimbo joins us live. The House leadership lauds the signing of the SIM Registration Act into law by President Bongbong Marcos on Monday. The president says the bill is timely and relevant as more Filipinos deal with the proliferation of tech scams and other related crimes. Also, what are the other priority bills of the Marcos administration? Let's go straight to the source of the story. Marikina Representative and House Committee on Appropriations Vice Chairperson Stella Quimbo. Good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Ria. Thanks for having me.
Now, Congresswoman, you were there to witness the signing of the SIM Registration Act into law. Please tell us why this law is so important right now.
Well, at this point in time, given that there are a lot of tech scams happening, so it's very important to register all SIM cards. And you might be happy to know that there are very strict confidentiality provisions in this law.
All right, Congressman, can you outline for us exactly how this law will help in reducing mobile-related crimes or scams? I mean, a person can register, but then that SIM could just be passed on to somebody else, right?
Yeah. So basically, at the point of sale, then the buyer would have to show some form of identification, and that information about the buyer would be kept by the seller. And at any point in time when, for example, the courts need to have access to this information, then the sellers should be able to provide that. So basically, it's a way to prevent crimes related to SIM cards that will be prevented.
All right, so it's a deterrent. Hopefully it acts that way. So
it's a deterrent.
What happens after this law is signed? Maybe you can run us through the steps and how long is it going to take before the law is fully implemented?
Well, the IRR needs to be drafted first. So basically, the step-by-step on how that registration will happen, the repository of that information, and access to that data set or database when needed. So that's still going to be ironed out. And after that, then it can be fully implemented.
All right. So maybe, Congresswoman, if you could take us through the process. For example, if somebody is already a prepaid user, how would they go about registering their SIM card?
It's at the point of sale. So moving forward, the next time that you need to purchase a SIM card, so it's a point of sale that information about the purchaser would be recorded.
All right. What about for existing prepaid users? If I already have a prepaid number, for example.
I think the capture is at the point of sale.
All right. Now, do telcos have the infrastructure or the capacity to register millions of SIM cards at this point?
Well, they should. I mean, at this point in time, if not, then they're required to. So I guess that's also the point of at this point in time when the IRR needs to be crafted, then of course that would be a signal to our telcos as to what particular capital outlay that they need to undertake in order to be fully compliant with the law.
All right. Have they told you or do you know what are the technical challenges in the full implementation of this law?
Well, of course, it would depend on exactly how the data would be captured. But I guess at this point, it's handling of the data, which would be huge amounts of data points. I guess that is going to be the biggest challenge at this point.
Now, Congresswoman, for Globe Telecom, and on their part, they said that they're ready to implement the new law, but this would be useless if users are allowed to submit just any ID. And they're saying that in order for this to become successful, there should be an effective national ID system. But as we all know, there are production backlogs in printing and the delivery of the IDs. How can this concern be addressed? Will they be accepting other government IDs like passports, driver's licenses, or voters' IDs in the meantime?
Yes, that is correct. Any valid government ID would be accepted. And at the same time, it might be good for you to know that the Philippine Statistics Authority had committed to Congress that by June of 2023, 92 million Filipinos would have a national ID by then. So by the end of the year, I think about half of that target would be met. And by June of next year, 92 million would have IDs.
All right. We talked earlier a little bit about the security issues surrounding this new law, Congresswoman. What are the safeguards in place in order to protect privacy?
Well, of course, penalties would be number one. Any breaches in confidentiality would, of course, entail penalties. At this point, I can't remember exactly what the penalties are, but that's the number one safeguard.
All right, and I'm sure those will be highlighted as well in the IRR. But what about the submission of information? Is that going to be manual, or is it something that can be done online?
Well, again, that's going to depend on the IRR. At this point in time, I suppose since we're not 100% digitalized yet, that's going to be a mix of both manual and automated.
All right. And remind us again, Congressman, when will the IIR be released?
I can't remember the details of the law. Typically, I don't know, maybe we have to check the law. I can't remember the exact date.
All right. Well, we'll be taking a short break and we will be back. This is The Source on CNN Philippines. Please stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. I'm Ria Tanjuatco-Trillo, and our guest this morning is Marikina Representative Stella Quimbo. Congresswoman, good morning once again. Now, we'd like to talk to you and ask you questions about the LEDAC meeting. President Bongbong Marcos convened the Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, or LEDAC, on Monday to discuss his priority measures. And there were at least 30 pieces of legislation that he wanted to pass. For you, Congresswoman, which are the most crucial ones and why? All right, Congresswoman.
Those related to health. Yes, those related to health are, for me, the most important ones. So those include the creation of a medical reserve corps, the creation of a CDC type of institution, meaning Center for Disease Control, and then a virology institute is also another one, and the establishment of regional specialty hospitals.
All right, so
as you know, what we've experienced during the pandemic, we really need to strengthen our health sector capacity, and these are important legislation towards that.
Absolutely. Were there any indications from the president who he might name as DOH secretary, given that these bills are really important?
None at this point. I didn't hear any information relating to that.
Okay. Now, how can we be sure that bills that the president wants to have prioritized are really well scrutinized and not just hastily passed because these are among his priorities?
Well, that's precisely why we need a LEDAC. So this is where four members of Congress, four members of the Senate, as well as members of the executive, and of course, including the president and the vice president, would come together and figure out what are the important legislative measures needed in the next couple of months. And more importantly, there is also a Philippine development report, which the NEDA is currently crafting. And a Philippine development report is issued every time we have a new president. And this would be covering the next 6 years. And this report would precisely have the recommended legislative priorities for every important sector of the country.
I see. Now, inflation is also a top concern, understandably. And in the latest Pulse Asia report, controlling inflation is really on the top of Filipinos' minds. Were there any proposed measures during the LEDAC meeting that could address the impact of inflation?
Well, actually, the most important source of inflation is food inflation. So, and as we know, the reason for why food prices are high is because of low supply, and particularly because we have not really invested a lot in our agriculture sector, and so there is a lot of scope for improvement in terms of efficiency in agriculture production. So right now, the fact that we have increased the budget of the Department of Agriculture significantly, at least for 2023, I think that is the most important step towards addressing inflation.
Now, speaking of the 2023 budget, could you talk to us about the status of the proposed 5.268 trillion budget? Are you still on track to have that approved on time?
Well, yes. So we had already approved on third reading the General Appropriations Bill for 2023 last September 28th. And so at this point in time, it is all we need to do is to print it and to transmit it to the Senate, and the target date is on the 25th of October. So yes, we are certainly on time as far as the House is concerned, and I believe that the Senate has also been conducting budget briefings as well at the committee level. And so when we resume on November 7, I suppose they would be all set to do plenary debates. The target is mid-December. So that should be enough time for this to be signed into law. And as you know, we need to sign this into law by the end of December of this year in order for us to avoid a reenacted budget.
All right. So far you are on time for that. How about when it comes to budget realignments? You had Albay Representative Edsel Lagman calling for the purging of 9 billion pesos worth of confidential and intelligence funds in various agencies. What's your view on that, and how can that be resolved?
So at this point, we identified various sources of funds for the 77.5 billion worth of realignments that the House proposed to the President's budget. And we identified sources like the DOTR, that's about 50 billion from the DOTR railway projects, as well as, for example, the NTF-LCAC, I think about 5 billion from that. So basically, the main basis for identifying sources of funds is really the ability for agencies to absorb these funds. So if historically there had been problems in using these funds on time, then those were the first candidates for realignments. And so based on our initial assessment, we did not have to realign from the confidential and intelligence funds. But of course, Ria, we still have a bicameral conference that will happen sometime in November. So let's see if there are proposals from the Senate to do so. Then obviously this is something that both the House and the Senate would need to discuss.
All right. Let's talk about unfunded programs. There's 1 billion for special risk allowance for healthcare workers, 25 billion for social pension hikes for indigent senior citizens, 66 million for cash benefits for Filipino centenarians, and 500 million in aid for cancer patients. And I think also 532 million for special education. What's going to happen now to these programs?
Well, so some of those we proposed alignments for, like for example, the social pension for seniors. We proposed a realignment of 5 billion pesos. Of course, we need 25. So hopefully, the Senate can find additional fund sources so that the full 25 billion can be funded. There are others like. For example, the Cancer Assistance Program, we also provided additional funds for that. Special education for the DepEd, we also realigned for that. So again, we're not yet done with finalizing additional fund sources for unfunded programs. So hopefully by with the BICAM, and with the help of the Senate as well, other unfunded programs which are necessary can be funded.
All right, ma'am, we'll be taking a short break, but we'll be back. This is A Source on CNN Philippines. Stay tuned. You're watching The Source on CNN Philippines. I'm Ria Tanjuatco-Trillo. Our source today, Marikina Representative Stella Quimbo. Welcome back to the program. Congresswoman, let's talk a little bit about the economy. And of course, you are an economist. We had the peso closing at 59 pesos per US dollar on Monday. Do we see this trend continuing in the coming months? And how much further could the peso fall?
Before I answer that, Ria, I think I owe you some information about the SIM card registration. So if I may,
please.
The deadline for the IRR is 60 days after yesterday. So that's the deadline. And also, you asked about existing SIM cards.
Yes.
There is also a deadline for that. Those with SIM cards already need to register with telcos within a certain time frame, and otherwise those SIM cards would be deactivated if not registered. So going back to your question on the exchange rate, so as we know, the peso depreciation is really a result of the policy rate hikes in the U.S. And so, and that is also the way for the U.S. to control their inflation. So unfortunately, as much as the U.S. will be increasing their policy rates, then unfortunately, the Philippines, through the BSP, would also possibly need to do that as well. So that's a reason for why we've been having this peso depreciation. So again, it depends on what the U.S. is doing to their interest rates.
Right. Now, some people are saying that the exchange rate could reach maybe up to 68 to the dollar. Secretary Jokno says it won't reach that levels. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, of course, it is very important for us to manage our exchange rate. If we have a very high exchange rate, meaning a very weak peso, and since we are very dependent on imported raw materials, especially oil, then having a very high exchange rate would mean inflation. And of course, we don't want to have high inflation rates, right? Because that affects the purchasing power of our consumers. So we cannot allow that to happen. And at this point in time, we have enough policy tools to manage our exchange rate. We have, of course, again, our own policy rates to be determined by the BSP. So if there's a need to defend our peso, then the BSP increases its policy rates, meaning the interest rate which is going to be charged against banks taking loans from the BSP. So that's one. And number two is our reserves of dollars. So if there's a need to directly participate in the foreign exchange market, we have enough U.S. dollar reserves to do that. So there are enough tools for us to manage our exchange rates. Of course, it's a tough balancing act. If you increase interest rates, of course, that would affect investment demand and could be contractionary in a sense. So that's what the BSP needs to do now. you increase interest rates so that you manage exchange rates, but at the same time, you need to also worry about what that will do to, for example, demand for consumer loans and especially business loans.
Absolutely. But ma'am, how do you see the ordinary Filipino experiencing greater inflation? I mean, we're already experiencing it now. What's it going to be like if it does, if in case it does get worse?
So again, we really need to manage our inflation. The biggest problem is food inflation. So at this point in time, it's important for the government to continue providing assistance so that food inflation can be stemmed. So particularly assistance for our farmers. If the government can continue giving, for example, food transport subsidies, meaning fuel subsidies to our farmers, that would be a great help in controlling food prices. So at this point in time, government needs to be proactive, and they have been proactive in providing assistance to our farm producers. So that has to be continued. And if the question is, can the government is the government capable of doing such? We also have to understand that when the exchange rate increases, as well as when the inflation rate increases, government coffers actually expand, right? Because there is a VAT on, for example, oil, which is imported. So when the price of oil increases as a result of higher exchange rate, then the VAT collected by government is higher. And at the same time, when inflation is higher, also VAT on purchases would also increase. So it kind of, there's also some a little bit of additional leg room for government to assist our consumers as well as small producers, particularly farmers.
All right, ma'am, in the past you've said na with this whole situation, na kalma lang. Is that still how you feel, or is it time to panic?
Well, at this point in time, again, because we have sufficient tools, and of course our economic managers are on it, they will be doing everything that they can to manage the situation. It's not easy, but they have, I believe, sufficient tools to do so. And more importantly, the credibility.
Right. Ma'am, let's shift the conversation now to POGOs. What is your stand on POGOs? Should we permanently ban them or at least institute reforms?
Well, in the previous Congress, what we did was to impose taxes on them. So it was a way to somehow regulate their activity. So if they want to do business here, then you've got to follow the laws and of course contribute to the local economy. So I think at this point in time, that's probably like a good middle ground. Of course, there are issues on what social effects that would have. Other issues like, for example, values of land, considering that many of them, of course, purchased land, and of course, rental values also increased when a lot of them came to the Philippines. So those are some other effects which need to be managed. But overall, I think first step is really to ensure that we're able to tax them properly.
Right. Now, there's a bit of a debate going on about how much we really benefit from the offshore gaming industry. Through your eyes, through the lens of an economist, does the Philippines really stand to benefit greatly from their presence here?
Well, again, it's really a matter of like, it's not easy to say that, yes, we benefit from it. It's a matter of weighing the pros and cons. So on one hand, there's of course more economic activity, but on the other hand, there are also possibly ill effects, particularly social effects, right? And so these need to be carefully weighed against each other. So it's not easy to say, yes, they bring in net gains. I think we need to look at the numbers more carefully.
All right, more discussion needed there, but that is all the time we have for our discussion. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. That was Marikina Representative Stella Quimbo. And thank you for joining us here on The Source. I'm Ria Tanjuatco-Trillo. You're watching CNN Philippines.